Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for waiting. Let us get started. Thank you for joining us out of your very busy schedules. I'm with Nikkei, Tokyo headquarters. My name is Kato. I'm Managing Executive Officer at Nikkei headquarters. I'm in charge of holding international conferences. Now, something called the Nikkei Forum, that's the brand name, and the international conferences, symposia have been operated by us. Asia, Future of Asia, that's one of the biggest ones that we organize. In addition to that, cross-border themes that need to be discussed: cyber, cosmos, the universe, environment. With these themes, we have been holding various events. Now, regarding today's Nikkei Forum, it's indeed very timely. Something really intriguing in terms of a theme. It's kind of an unusual lineup we are fortunate to have today, and I'm so delighted. January this year, the Trump administration was inaugurated. It's been so unexpected, and President Trump himself seems to be using it to a certain extent for his bargaining power. Why is it like this? What will be the consequences? I'm pretty sure people are really, really interested in this. So, spending 90 minutes, we really would like to get into the details of this matter. Regarding the CV of the speakers, I'm pretty sure many of you have already seen them on the website. I don't want to say too much. Dr. Kurt Campbell, former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State during Biden administration. And before that, at the White House, the Indo-Pacific coordinator, East Asia, Indo-Pacific policies. He has been the kind of a commanding authority for quite a very long time. He is an expert on this matter. Matt Pottinger, in the first Trump administration, he was in charge of Asia, and then on the security matter, he served as the deputy. He was in charge of the Deputy National Security Advisor, and Mr. Akiba, Senior Advisor to Cabinet, former National Security Advisor for more than 30 years. He has been the leader in the Japanese diplomacy. With these three members of the panel, what's actually happening in this world? What about the U.S.-China relations? And then what about the U.S.-Japan relations? What about the framework of the international economy? Concerning these themes, we definitely would like to have a good discussion. So, three members of the panel, please join me in welcoming our panel. Please come up to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we start? Mr. Akiba and myself will speak in Japanese. Kurt and Matt will be discussing in English. Yesterday, from the end of last week and over to this day, U.S. has attacked Iranian nuclear facilities, and all the news is 100% attack on Iran. There was a discussion it could be possible. However, as for the timing and is it going to happen really or not, the U.S. media has discussed it as surprising. Including such affairs, first of all, may I ask Dr. Campbell, followed by Mr. Pottinger and Akiba-san. May I ask first in that order? January 2025 was the start of the second Trump administration. And what is the international order that the Trump government is looking for? America First is the slogan. And what is the vision that the government is looking for? And then you could comment about Iran, if that is related to the vision of America First. Over the 4 months since January inauguration already, indeed, 5 months have passed. What did we learn after the start of the second administration? That would be my first question, please.
First of all, Kato-san, thank you very much for bringing us together today. I just want to thank him and Nikkei. I want to underscore the role that they have played, not only on a daily reporting, but the Mount Fuji Dialogue now serves as really the most important venue, bringing strategists from all over the world that talk not only about the U.S.-Japan relationship, but the role in global politics. Grateful for his support and engagement, and it's an honor to be with two people that I admire very much. Matt Pottinger served with great distinction as Deputy National Security Advisor. I do want to just underscore that he was one of the people that when I was in power always reached out to offer counsel, ideas and suggestions, and as importantly would counsel when he thought things were not going the right direction. I appreciated that. I think he approached it from a sense of sort of national identity and idea that we could work together. I give him credit. He was the person who reached out at the outset of our administration and said that we should continue to adopt the Indo-Pacific free and open framework, something that Prime Minister Abe had championed. His support helped make that a point of continuity in the Biden administration. I'm grateful for his friendship and support. And then our good friend Akiba-san has been a stalwart, not only the most effective national security advisor I've ever worked with, but a great supporter of the U.S.-Japan relationship. It's an honor to be up here with him. So Kato-san has asked a very important question, and we're going to be interested to hear what Matt has to say more directly. I would say that on many issues in the Trump administration, that policy is still forming. It's still taking shape, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific. I think the early indications and desire for the administration was to spend more focus, more time on the challenges of the Indo-Pacific. But like many administrations that have come before, including my own, other issues intervene. And so, at least at the outset, the focus internationally has been more on the challenges of Ukraine and now the Gulf. And I think we have yet to see the full dimensions of the strategy in the Indo-Pacific. What we've seen to date have been largely through the lens of trade negotiations. And I think most of that set of negotiations with allies and partners have been unsettling and concerning, unclear about where that's headed and what to expect in terms of the ultimate resolution of some of these contentious trade-related issues. On the recent strikes, I think the truth is that the jury probably is still out about the ultimate effectiveness of these strikes. We do not know yet about the bomb damage assessment. We're not clear about whether it was effective in fundamentally setting back the course of Iran's nuclear ambitions. I will say we've seen elements both in MAGA world, some people on President Trump's team, and some Democrats who've rushed to criticize these actions. I would probably counsel waiting and seeing how this has played out. And I do think we need to underscore that over the course of the last 25 or 30 years, the country that has taken steps to undermine both the United States and other countries in the region and globally has been Iran, destabilizing governments around the region, promoting groups that use violence not only against Israel, but Europe and the United States more directly. And so I think these steps, which are aimed primarily at the nuclear program, I think can be clearly explained internationally. And you've seen most recently in the last few hours, the Australian government has come out in support of these steps. My only concern, beyond the effectiveness, my preference would be to take actions like this in conjunction with other allies and partners. And so I think the most important thing for American strategy is to work with our closest allies and partners, including Japan. I think there occasionally is a desire or an instinct to act alone. I think the challenges that we are facing globally require the United States to work in concert with allies and partners. That was one of the things I respected most about Matt, the desire to strengthen those partnerships. At the top of that list is the relationship between the United States and Japan. And I think I can say with, complete honesty that we turned over the U.S.-Japan relationship on January 20th in one of the strongest periods in our history. Strong support in both countries for the alliance, increased defense spending, alignment on every issue from China to the Pacific Islands. I give Akiba-san great credit in that. Where it goes from here will be up to this administration. My hope is that they will recognize at the top levels that this relationship is central to everything that we're seeking to do, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but the world as a whole. Thank you, Kato-san.
Kato-san, thank you for having us today, and thank you all for coming. And I want to thank my friend Kurt Campbell for your excellent leadership over many administrations and your counsel to me when I was in office. So thank you for that. Thank you to Akiba-san as well. Kurt and I we're lucky that we both were able to interact with Akiba-san at various points in the U.S.-Japan relationship. And he really is someone who helped ensure that Japan and the United States came out stronger as an alliance over the course of his time. So thanks for that. I'll pick up where Kurt left off on Iran for just a minute, because I do think it's useful to step back and look at what Iran has done going all the way back to its revolution in 1979, and specifically its policy. Remember, the Ayatollah, in a speech 2 years ago, said the following. He said, "When we chant death to America, it is not a slogan, it is our policy." That's a direct quote from the current Ayatollah. And he has made good on that policy. The Iranian regime kidnapped the entire remaining staff of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and kept them hostage for more than a year, starting in 1979. In 1983, the Iranian regime launched 2 suicide truck bombings in Lebanon through their newly created proxy Hezbollah to blow up the U.S. Embassy and to blow up U.S. military post, U.S. Marines post, who were there as peacekeepers, killing hundreds. In the 1990s, they blew up, the Iranians provided the operational support and training to destroy Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, killing 19 U.S. service personnel and injuring hundreds more. In the 2000s, it was the Iranian regime that provided these armor-piercing, highly specialized roadside bombs that killed hundreds of U.S. soldiers in Iraq and maimed thousands more. And then I think it's worth also remembering what a catastrophic miscalculation the Iranian regime made when it trained and supported and equipped Hamas in Gaza to conduct its raids into Israel on October the 7th, 2023, killing well over 1,000 civilians, more than 1,000 Israelis. And that was the beginning of a 7-front war against Israel, a 7-front war. Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Palestine Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, militia in Syria, militia groups in Iraq, and of course the Houthi rebels in Yemen, And then Iran itself, all of them launched attacks on Israel over the course of the last 18 months. And it is only understandable that Israel would choose to defend itself, and it has done so in spectacular form. President Trump came into office offering every opportunity to Iran to give up its military enrichment of uranium. This is a military program that has enriched uranium far beyond the levels that would ever be necessary for civilian use. Even after Israel attacked the week before last, the President Trump still sought a negotiated settlement, but Iran sent the message over and over again, no, we will not settle. We will not compromise. So I do believe that President Trump took a bold, courageous decision, really on behalf of the peace-loving world, to try to destroy the means of making the worst weapons ever devised. I would only add one other thing to your question, Kato-san, about what is it that President Trump is trying to achieve. I speak only for myself, but having worked for him for 4 years, I think that you could sum up President Trump not as an isolationist, not certainly as an internationalist either. He is his own unique sort of ideology in a way. And you could sum it up with 3 words that start with the letter R. And these are words that he uses time and again if you pay attention. One is reciprocity. And reciprocity means that allies, as well as adversaries, will be treated the way that Trump believes they are treating the United States. So when it comes to allies, that means he wants to see more burden sharing. Whenever I briefed him before he spoke to a foreign leader, he would always ask me 2 questions. What is the U.S. trade deficit with that country? And how much is that country spending on defense as a percentage of that country's GDP? So if a country can provide promising answers to both of those questions, that they're trying to help the U.S. balance trade, that they're trying to increase their burden sharing on defense, they're probably going to have a pretty good relationship with President Trump. I'll leave it at that for now. Reciprocity is really the most important of those words, and we'll revisit some of the other themes later.
Well, thank you so much for giving us this kind of an opportunity to Kato-san and the Nikkei. Thank you very much. I don't participate in an event like this very often, but I still have the senior advisor to the cabinet title, so there are limited things I can share with you. Having said that, I'm already a private person, so I definitely would like to enjoy the freedom of speech to a certain extent. With 2 gentlemen, Kurt Campbell, of course, U.S.-Japan relations. You have been engaged in this for a very long time. And Fukushima, when that nuclear accident occurred, together with the ambassador, I went to the office and then I just consulted with him. And he showed me one picture. The following day, after the accident, a drone flew over the Fukushima nuclear power plant, and the photo was taken, or photos were taken by the drone. On top of that, automatic distribution to UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. That's what it says. That's 5 eyes. And in Japan, it cannot be shown. So because of the rules, it cannot be shared. Yet, over the table, I was able to sort of get a glance of it. And Dr. Campbell-san, within the US government, he convinced others who are against this. On the following day, he kindly delivered the photo to me, and then I sent it to Tokyo right away. That's my memory. So Dr. Campbell have been cherishing the U.S.-Japan relations, and he treated did the diplomacy in a way that we felt that we are treated in a special manner. Now, Matt, in the first Trump administration, and when Prime Minister visited the U.S. for the first time, I was in the office, and then together with Matt, I had a chance to come up with a joint statement. I still remember that joint statement. It's still valid. It was great around Trump-Abe era. That was the beginning, and it was really befitting for that occasion. Now, it's the second Trump administration, and again, Prime Minister Akiba and President Trump, when they had a meeting, you might not have read it in detail, but that was, again, a great joint statement. And President Trump and Prime Minister Akiba, I really hope that this will actually determine our relationship. This was a great statement. I would like to encourage you to read it. Now, about Iran, the government of Japan's position, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, many people have already made statements, I believe. But this is just my personal view. Regarding the situation we find ourselves in, with DPRK, there's North Korea. And Defense Secretary Perry, I actually heard this, trying to do a surgical strike against North Korea. Preparation was already going on. Then President Carter, he visited the peninsula and then decided to start the peace negotiations. That's why this surgical strike did not materialize. And what happened? We have been suffering from these nuclear programs in North Korea. So, violation of international law, many people in media call that. It's not. And according to the UN Charter D51, there has to be a military strike, so it might be difficult. But nuclear weapons, these weapons are being developed by North Korea, and you cannot stop it. Given that situation, if you look at the current technology, precision attack is possible, and that stopping that nuclear development. Can we, if you call that the violation of international order, that will put a period, because we suffered so much. I think it's different. Personally, this is how I feel. Anyway, the US President, President Trump, and as I said, the top leaders are now beginning to establish a good relationship. So the US-Japan relation, US-Japan alliance evolution is something that I would like to see happen. Thank you very much. U.S.-Japan relations importance. Concerning this, from the three gentlemen, once again, we heard directly from you. But before moving into that subject, very briefly about Iran, the U.S. attacks against Iran, red line, not being able to stop their nuclear development. Matt called this, it was a courageous decision. Here in East Asia, against North Korea, it can be possible. Should we take it as a message like that? Or because of these specific, Iran-specific reasons, it's not something that what has happened against Iran will not constitute a standard decision-making by President Trump. So first, Dr. Campbell.
The challenge that Akiba-san mentioned is that there may have been an opportunity decades ago to contemplate direct military action against North Korea, the DPRK. My own view is that period has passed. The DPRK has a substantial arsenal, substantial conventional capabilities. The best we can do is to ensure that the deterrent and the warfighting capability of the United States, of the ROK, of Japan together send a clear and unmistakable message of deterrence to the North Korean leadership. And I believe that is what we have done, and you see unprecedented coordination across a number of sectors between the United States, the ROK, and Japan in recent years, and I think that process should continue going forward. Let's recall what's transpired over the course of the last couple of months. What Israel has managed to do in succession, it is clearly facing enormous security challenges in Gaza, and they were surprised in Gaza. But the plans that have been implemented in Lebanon and Syria and now Iran, I think underscore the tremendous capabilities that Israel has, both in terms of intelligence and military capabilities. No one would have ever imagined that it would be possible to eliminate essentially Iran's ability to control its skies. But as it currently exists, Israel and the United States have been able to operate with impunity over the skies of Iran and conduct operations with very little risk. And that is an unprecedented set of circumstances. And I think, Kato-san, no one would have expected that that was possible. The question now going forward is, will the Iranians enter into some form of negotiations with the United States or other countries in Europe to try to establish a way forward? What we saw in the initial discussions between the Europeans and Iran is a very clear statement that they were not prepared to negotiate while the country was at war or under attack. I think the truth is that Iran has been profoundly weakened. Its ability to use proxies against Israel and the United States have also been deeply reduced. It does have some options. Maybe Matt can talk a little bit about that. There are worries about what could happen in the Gulf of Hormuz and elsewhere. But at the same time, it has to be careful, because if it takes steps, the ability for Israel and the United States to retaliate directly is real. And I think it's important for the Iranians to be able to do a clear assessment of how vulnerable they are in terms of their ability to sustain further military damage. And the potential for those attacks to continue are real. So I think the next little while is going to be important. My hope would be that there will be some form of diplomacy on the way forward that will prevent this very delicate set of circumstances to escalate into a wider regional war, which is in no one's best interests.
I agree with Kurt that the Iranian regime really has to make the decision now about what will next transpire. I think when President Trump threatened over the weekend to punish Iran even more severely than he did through his airstrikes over the weekend, I think we should take that very seriously, and so should Iran. At the same time, I think President Trump has shown restraint and is willing to negotiate a settlement so long as it leads to a verifiable elimination of the nuclear program, of the Iranian nuclear program. So it's really up to Iran. I'm not an Iran expert. I think that they have surprised me through their capacity to, or willingness to take on a colossus, namely the United States of America. There aren't many countries that deliberately attack the United States and its interests and come away unscathed. One thing that's worth remembering as well is that beginning in 2021, the Iranian regime began sending groups of assassins. They would hire criminal organizations to assassinate Americans on U.S. soil. This is an incredible breach of an American red line. They tried 3 times to kill an American woman in New York, in Brooklyn, because of her blogging. They didn't like her Farsi language blogging that she was doing. And they also made 2 attempts to assassinate candidate for president Donald Trump. I'm not talking about the well-known cases of someone who shot President Trump in the ear and another person who tried to ambush him on his golf course. Those were lone wolf attacks, but the Department of Justice has prosecuted 2 separate cases, different cases, of assassins hired by the Iranian regime to try to assassinate Trump. So, given all the talk about regime change and whether the U.S. should pursue regime change, and I don't think that is Trump's intention, it's worth remembering that the Iranian regime attempted regime change on the United States by killing the lead candidate for president last year.
Surgical strike to North Korea, that the window is over, that it is no longer possible, considering their weapon and the irregular trajectory and the hypersonic missiles they already have, and we are under the threat of North Korea. And therefore, if a surgical strike is implemented, the risk is excessively high. And therefore, back then, President Carter had already retired from office, and a retiree, based on the latest information, was not shared with the government. It was based on his goodwill, personal intelligence, but the history was changed, and it was changed into the direction that Japan did not wish. But we have to carefully understand that historical background because of that decision back then. Thank you. Then, if I may, going to Indo-Pacific, more into the area around this place, may I ask Matt, Trump 2.0 and Trump 2.0's approach vis-à-vis China, strategic priority vis-à-vis China. What comes to the top? What is the second in terms of China policy? What do you think is number 1 and number 2? Mr. Campbell, Dr. Campbell, you mentioned about the Indo-Pac policy, that it is still in formation, that it is still forming, you mentioned. And I would like to ask Matt if you agree. And from Matt's perspective, what is the priority, number 1, number 2, vis-à-vis China?
Well, again, only speaking of my own observations of the Trump administration, President Trump first came to power in the 2016 election running on the idea that Beijing had taken severe advantage of the United States in trade and in theft of intellectual property and in subsidies for Chinese businesses. That in essence, I had a conversation with President Trump years ago where we discussed China's entry into the WTO in 2001 as being really a major strategic mistake by the United States that really led to the situation we're in. And by the way, I don't blame anyone for that decision. I was a journalist working in China when the U.S. was negotiating to try to bring China into the WTO. I was among the majority of Americans who were very hopeful that this would lead China to become a more liberal system, at least economically, and hopefully a bit more liberal, at least around the edges politically as well. I was hopeful that this would lead to greater cooperation over a long period of time between the United States and China. But hopes sometimes are dashed, and that's what happened given Beijing's own strategy under its form of government and under its current leadership in particular. And so President Trump's first priority is to rectify this gross imbalance in the economic relationship. I think second for him is Beijing's deliberate export of fentanyl and the precursor chemicals that can be used to make fentanyl. And third, just more generally, his desire to deter Beijing from undertaking military aggression in ways that would be profoundly disruptive for all of us. Now, I think Kurt is going to talk a little bit about the fact that there is not yet a clear strategy necessarily that has emerged from the new administration, and there are groups within the administration that have different ideas about how to achieve those goals. In some cases, maybe there are even people who don't share the president's goals entirely, but we can talk some more about that, but I'd love to hear from Kurt.
Thanks, Matt. Kata-san, to your question, and just to carry on what Matt has indicated, I think one of the biggest challenges, one of the areas where Matt and I both struggled within our respective governments, is a desire to spend more time, focused attention, and resources on the Indo-Pacific. I think we both recognize, and I think it is generally recognized, that the biggest challenges will play out here, and that the lion's share of the history of the 21st century will be written in the Indo-Pacific, and that while the United States has professed a desire to spend more time and attention on these issues, sometimes we get drawn away. We get drawn away by either domestic issues, other important pursuits in the Middle East, the Gulf states, or in Europe. And the consequence of that has been not enough resources, not enough attention for the critical issues that are playing out in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think one of the things that we worry about is what we have seen to date has been more focus, again, on critical issues that demand attention in the Middle East and Europe, but as a consequence, perhaps not as much focus on things that we think are of critical importance in the Indo-Pacific. I agree with Matt that there are different groups, different perspectives, particularly on China policy. I think generally speaking, there is agreement on the importance of Japan and other allies. How to manifest that still has yet to be fully resolved, but it is China policy where there are the greatest differences and gaps. And so even though the second administration, Trump administration, is very different from the first, more buttoned down, more disciplined than the first, the one area where there is some continuity is some uncertainty about China policy. You have real China hawks, you have some people that want to cut a deal on economics, and others who are looking perhaps to even do more and believe that have to figure out a way to work more closely with China. I think it is still unclear which of these groups will be the most dominant group among those that are vying for focus and favor within the Trump administration. I would simply say in this period, the Council engagement of Japan is central. It is critical that Japan convey and engage at the highest levels in the way that Akiba-san did to the U.S. government, the challenges in the Indo-Pacific, the need to do more, the need to have focused attention. My own sense is that every challenge that the United States has ever faced in our history, during the Cold War, during the Second World War, we had the capacity to deal with that challenge largely alone. This is the first time that we are grappling with challenges largely emanating from China, involving technology and the like, that require us, demand that we work more effectively with allies and partners. I think ensuring that we have a bipartisan commitment, and I will say I'm proud of the fact that we had strong bipartisan support for almost everything we did in technology, in the Quad, in AUKUS, trilateral engagement between the United States, Japan, and South Korea. Continuing that bipartisan commitment to working with allies and partners, I believe, is a central feature of an effective foreign policy going forward. Akiba-san?
About the relationship with China. In 2022, the national security strategy it wrote that it's the biggest security challenge, and it's in the same vector of the U.S. policies. So based on this recognition, this is the very major principles. But throughout my career, if you look at the relationship, big countries to big country relation, it's inevitable that they try to strike a deal because it's in their interests. In that case, the interests of an allied country like Japan make sure that the Japanese interests will not be impaired. That's our belief. So with the United States, having patience to get engaged with the country like the United States, that's important. And I think that's what we have been doing in our diplomacy. But sometimes regarding because China has grown so much, so that it's inevitable that they should have this kind of a strong military power. And Japan thought otherwise. We expressed that. We have to communicate that. And then getting engaged with the United States is important. The U.S. responsibility is extraordinary because with Xi Jinping directly, I think it's only the U.S. president who can really engage him for quite a long time, because Xi Jinping, when he comes to Japan, he has to be treated like the state guest. It's the same with other countries, but in the case of the United States, it's different. Even if he is not treated as the state guest, he will still go to the United States, Xi Jinping. So regarding these Chinese practices, I hope this will be changed, because country like Japan, Japan is also should be important country for China. They acknowledge that. In that case, state guest, this is the diplomatic protocol. Of course, I mean, it's a state guest, he has to be treated in a special manner. But even he's not the state guest, coming to Japan and having a dialogue with Japan, and then Japanese, the officials should be able to visit China and have a direct dialogue. I hope that the US will push them into that direction.
Thank you. Indeed, President Trump himself has to decide what he wants to do vis-a-vis China. He has not made up his mind. There are different views within the administration, but if the president himself has to make up his mind, then no one knows what he has in mind in terms of the approach he wants to take vis-a-vis China. Matt, you mentioned about allies, and you mentioned reciprocity as one of the 3 R's. This applies to China as well. US and China are not allies at all. However, some kind of a deal, do you think could be concluded? Does Mr. Trump think there is a possibility? Because from Dr. Campbell's perspective, would this be a correct option? And I ask Matt, followed by Kurt, if I may. And what Japan ought to do goes to Akiba-san.
Well, we all know that President Trump likes to make deals. It's part of his identity. That said, the experience of COVID in 2020, I think, may have had a permanent effect on President Trump's view of the People's Republic of China and its leader, Xi Jinping. And that's because Beijing not only hid accurate data about this new virus at its outset, claiming that it was not a major problem, encouraging the world not to cut off passenger traffic from China, but also used the crisis, once it became clear that it was a pandemic, to advance its interests through coercion. Namely, Xi Jinping's government withheld access to masks and other personal protective equipment, to certain medicine or ingredients that go into medicine. It actually basically put a gun to the head of Australia and made a 12-point or so list of demands, political demands, of the Australian government, and cut off trade from Australia, much of Australia's trade, unless Australia would submit to this blackmail. I'm very proud that Australia did not submit to that blackmail, but I think that changed President Trump's perception permanently. And if you look at the fact that President Trump was willing to put 145% tariffs on China earlier in this administration, far above and beyond the tariffs that he was threatening on any other country, what that tells you is that he's looking to decouple. He's looking to accelerate the decoupling between China and the United States. The problem is that he's discovered that there are certain things that the United States still remains heavily dependent on China for. And of course, China still is dependent on the United States for many things. So this is a messy process. You can't sever trade, but nonetheless, I think that President Trump's instinct is to try to diversify supply chains, to try to reindustrialize the United States. That's another one of the R words that he likes, reciprocity. Another is reindustrialization. But it's proving very difficult to do, but nonetheless, that's where I think his heart probably is.
Kato-san, I very much like the way that Matt laid that out. And I think he probably has greater insights into ultimate thinking of President Trump. I will say, I think it has turned out to be more difficult to effect fundamental decoupling than many of the advocates have suggested. So if you look at areas where the United States knows we have clear vulnerabilities in critical minerals and rare substances that are so necessary for technology and other forms of manufacturing, we've made remarkably little progress in diversifying. We've talked about it a lot, and we've made some initial investments, but the actual reliance on China is still fundamental. And so I think one of the challenges that we're likely to live with for the period ahead is this. After 35 years, and again, I think Matt's right, we did not question the logic of investment and interdependence until relatively recently. The Kissingerian logic was very powerful among our national elite. And so it is fair to say that the two countries that are perhaps the most interdependent in the world right now in a variety of ways are the United States and China. Now, I think it is fair also to say that the leadership in both countries are seeking to undo that interdependence. And so the interdependence is profound, and it is also the case that both countries are deeply uncomfortable with that interdependence and are seeking to take steps to ease it. But it turns out that some of those steps are difficult. And I think some of the things that President Trump has done in terms of targeting China, I don't think enough preparation has been taken to create backup plans for certain things. And so it turns out if China, for instance, decided to withhold certain kinds of magnets, whole swaths of our industrial and military capability would ground to a halt. And so I think the project ahead, more than anything else, requires the United States to think carefully and strategically with our allies and partners about how to diversify, how to strengthen our joint capacities in technology, critical minerals, and the like, and recognize that we are fundamentally in a competitive arena with China. And that is clear across many technological sectors, Kato-san. 5G, AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, robotics. These are all areas that China has laid out a clear plan for not only national dominance, but global dominance. And it is not really about coexistence. They're seeking to put out of business competitive industries in all of our countries, including in Japan. And I think the argument, and I think an argument that Matt and I believe Akiba-san are united behind, is the need to work with allies and partners to address this issue. We cannot do this alone. And so the real risk, I believe, in the Trump administration is not between internationalism and isolationism. I think that is too narrow. I think the real challenge is that there are some in the United States that believe it is possible for the United States to go it alone, to attack these issues without it's hard to work with Europeans, it's hard to work with certain other states in the Indo-Pacific, so we'll just take that on ourselves. And we're going to find that these challenges are so deep and so profound that we do not have the capacity to be able to handle those issues independently. We need to work with allies and partners, and that means reimagining these partnerships. They cannot be paternalistic. They have to be as equals. And so one of the things that I'd like to see as we do diplomacy with China, with Japan and Australia, is that we don't dictate terms about what needs to happen, that we work with these countries. I will tell you, Akiba-san was central in seeing Japan take remarkable steps on the security side. But these were steps that Japan took because of their own assessment of their security environment. They were not imposed on Japan by the United States. And so the key is to recognize that democratic states require a certain kind of respect and a certain kind of recognition that you have to follow a process about how decisions are taken. And I'm hopeful that over time we'll see more of that in the conduct, formulation, and execution of foreign policy in the Trump team.
Well, Kurt, I support that. I agree with you 100%, Kurt. Now, President Trump, when he was inaugurated, the president himself's specific plans must have been there. And I really felt that strongly because as he took office, one after another, various policies have been announced, and with executive order, he handled them. There must have been very explicit goal purpose. Regarding China, I understand policies are still being formulated. But as president, I think the U.S. has to be number one. U.S. will keep being number one. I think that's what he cannot concede. Now, tariff is one, and also the military issues are another. And then I think that's the background of various policies. For Japan, it can be beneficial to Japan. So on this matter, with the United States, we have to have even deeper dialogue with the U.S. Kurt talked about supply chain. Again, 100% dependence on China. In some cases, with rare earth, we are 100% dependent. And then we create intermediates, then exporting them to the United States. Concerning the supply chain issues, about the sensor issues, we are in an environment where we can observe things even better than the U.S. can. On this issue, we need to deepen our dialogue between the U.S. and Japan. In an alliance, the 100% decoupling from China is impossible for us. So irrespective of that, Japan suffers economically. This will never be in the interest of the United States. So having clear understanding that, the supply chain, economic security, top leaders are actually agreed upon between the U.S. and Japan, and we must deepen the discussions there.
Thank you very much. Going into more specifics, as Mr. Akiba has mentioned, in February there was the U.S.-Japan First Leaders Summit between Prime Minister Akiba and President Trump, which was highly appreciated. I traveled to Washington, and whether it be Democrats or Republicans or people outside the government or think tank and experts, whoever I ask as a debut, the first leader summit, everybody says it was a huge success. I hope you agree. But since then, the tariff issue has emerged, and President Trump said that the U.S.-Japan security alliance is unequal, and the tariff is not resolved. Of course, there should be reasons, but whatever the reasons, it is not resolved. And 3.5% of the GDP, and including related infrastructure, it should go up to 5% of the GDP. The defense expenditure is demanded by U.S. Mr. Akiba, Japan-U.S. relationship. Dr. Campbell, since until January 2025, the bilateral relationship was the peak, was at the best. And Mr. Akiba, is it at the best situation? Mr. Trump does not think Japan is so important. I think quite a lot of Japanese people feel that Trump does not really seriously think Japan is important. What is your take? Japan has to look at Japan objectively. Vis-a-vis the United States, Japan has a surplus, and Japan had the largest surplus. Currently, Japan's trade surplus is number 7 or number 8 in the world. Just because we are an ally, can the tariff be resolved ahead of any other countries? I don't think there is such an incentive. So Japan has to carefully assess its own position more objectively, I think. And President Trump, I said he does have a clear vision when he took office. What I meant was clear is when he visited the Middle East, he delivered a speech in Saudi Arabia, which he mentioned clearly. Many of the part was, of course, the message to the leadership of Middle East country and Saudi Arabia. But apart from that, he mentioned something important, which was, I oppose neoconservatives and intervention. To intervene in other affairs. I am not going to be interventionist. He made this clear. What did he mean? Into the other political regime, he is not interested. It should be decided by the God. God only knows alone. And what I want to pursue is a U.S. interest, which is America first. That he said clearly. So I think we have to pay attention to this part of his speech. As we look back, after the Cold War, the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, where is it going to go? When there was a question, the people of the government, including Dr. Campbell here back then, in 1996, U.S.-Japan Security Declaration was issued, which was a breakthrough declaration. The Security Alliance, that was for the Cold War, but no longer, not only for the Cold War, even after the Cold War, in order to ensure peace and security, it continues, and that is the spirit of the declaration. Democracy and freedom, such values, and the interest of both of the countries were strongly declared, and that the bilateral relationship will be deepened. That was advocated, but that time has passed, and what has happened now? To put values in the forefront rather than the values, why not place national interest in the front line? I think that a perspective change, whether it be in the US or Japan, the NSS, the National Security Secretariat, advising the leaders and to the media, and the online impact is increasing. To the national population, if it is an inexplicable logic, and to improve the security, it's becoming even more difficult to explain the national interest, and therefore we have a so-and-so relationship with a particular country. Unless the government makes a clear explanation to the population will not be convinced. And the U.S. is demanding how much percent of the GDP in defense expenditure, and then Japan has to explain Japan's position with transparency so that U.S. population, Japanese population, both can be convinced. That approach is important. Otherwise, the bilateral relationship will be undermined. So I think I want more transparency, and I hope it will become more transparent. Both countries have to make effort for more transparency, I think.
Yes, yes.
Could I just say one word? I don't want to just openly take issue with one thing that you said, but I do want to try to clarify for this audience. The idea somehow that the United States or political leaders take this alliance for granted, I think is wrong. And I just want to lay that out clearly. And Akiba-san talked about the summit in 1996. I was there at that summit. I helped work on it between then Prime Minister Hashimoto and President Clinton. And it was a remarkable achievement at the time, but look at the distance that we've traveled since. And I give Matt enormous credit during the beginning of the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. It was Matt behind the scenes that ensured that one of the people that helped President Trump really understand the dynamics of what was playing out in the Indo-Pacific was Prime Minister Abe. And we have been blessed by very strong Japanese leaders in the past decade and a half. Prime Minister Abe obviously gets an enormous amount of credit. Prime Minister Kishida deserves more credit for all the remarkable things that he did quietly, but just incredible successes in driving Japan's role on the international stage, not just the Indo-Pacific, but I will say one of the most important developments has been the increasing links between the Indo-Pacific and particularly Japan and Europe. Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Kishida drove those steps. We've seen enormous innovation and dynamism in the last 10 or 15 years in Japanese foreign policy. Again, Akiba-san can get much credit for that. But I think the reality that the United States cannot operate effectively in the Indo-Pacific without Japan is well understood politically in the United States. The truth is, it is often the case with sometimes your most treasured allies that you do not reaffirm that enough publicly. It's almost taken for granted. What Matt did with Prime Minister Abe, he was the most effective leader with President Trump, without question, no comparison. He was the person that helped the president understand the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. I believe the fact that Japan is our most important global ally is now well understood politically in the United States between Republicans and Democrats. We should say that more often, and we should say thank you more often. That's just not how Americans operate sometimes now. And I'm sorry for that, but I'm at least telling you this as I'm out of power now. But the truth is, it is well understood inside government how important Japan is to everything that we do. And I mean everything from the Pacific. And I will tell you now, as the United States has largely withdrawn from the world of providing aid and assistance, I regret that decision. But countries like Japan have stepped up to continue support for humanitarian and other health challenges globally. That is tremendous credit to Japan. We do recognize its importance.
If I can just add to second what you just heard from Kurt, President Trump spoke to his Japanese counterpart more often than he spoke to any other world leader. Any other world leader. And that was in meetings and phone calls and meals shared together. And I was always struck by the range of topics that President Trump worked on with Prime Minister Abe, and after that with Prime Minister Suga. It was North Korea and as well as South Korea relationship. It was about Taiwan. It was about India and Australia and the Quad, which took full flight during the Biden administration under Kurt's leadership, really got a running start going with cabinet-level meetings during the Trump administration. Abe and Trump worked together on Iran. They worked together at the G7 and on trade issues. So the good news is I don't think you need to be concerned that Trump does not place sufficient importance on Japan and on the U.S. relationship with Japan.
Thank you. The Japan-US Security Alliance, in order to discuss our bilateral relationship, many of the audience listening in to this seminar, what you are thinking, and I think the business risks the economic risk, in particular the tariff or external economic policy, including the tariff policy, day after day it changes. I wonder how it is being translated into English, but morning and evening the news is different. The tariff, no, it is going to be paused. No, tariff and pause. It changes day after day or morning and evening. And it's difficult for us to predict the outcome of this tariff talks. And even if I ask Mr. Akiba, I don't expect an answer from you, I have to admit. But having said that, why does Mr. Trump think tariff is so important? I think I have a vaguely better idea. Reindustrialization of the United States. He wants to bring back manufacturing capability to his country. I think that is part of the reason. And free trade was not necessarily an advantage for the U.S. Or did not work in the interest for the U.S., Mr. Trump thinks. And even after Mr. Trump leaves office, would this position of the U.S. Continue? Would this be the public opinion of the U.S. and sentiment that will continue, that free trade or free trade with WTO at the core, is it already over, even after the Trump administration? And if that is the case, what will be the future trade regime of the world, even after the Trump administration? What does U.S. want to see in terms of a trade regime post-Trump 2.0? Or what would be a trade regime desirable for Japan after the Trump administration if the WTO-based regime has gone away? May I start with Dr. Campbell? For the United States, America First international trade regime, what does it look like?
Kata-san, thank you very much. Look, I would just simply say I think there are plenty of questions. Matt just put his finger on it about China's role in the WTO, and I think that has created concerns and anxiety about how that system has been distorted. But I think generally speaking, there has been largely agreement among other leading states about the rules and procedures of global trade. And so I probably would be aligned with the president on some concerns about China. I myself have questions about conducting this strategy of looking at major tariffs against our closest allies. I have questions about the ultimate goals. If, for instance, you look over the last 4 or 5 years and ask who are the biggest investors in technology in the United States, other than the United States itself, number 1 and 2 are Japan and South Korea. And they are investing in long-life batteries, in innovative issues associated with 5G, just across the board. I will also say I do believe, I like what Matt says about reindustrialization. I would just point out that 2 of the most important bills passed during the Biden administration, which the president did sign, but were largely engineered by Republicans in the Senate. And they involved major investments in technologies, largely in red districts in the United States, which I think is a major effort towards reindustrialization. Many of those programs are now being retrenched as a result of some domestic negotiations. And so I agree with the goal. In fact, I think one of the common features of both President Trump and President Biden is that both saw how big parts of the country had been abandoned largely over decades, and there needed to be efforts at reinvesting in communities that had lost jobs and in industries that would be defining of the 21st century. But in truth, the United States is going to have to make concerted efforts over successive administrations if we're going to be effective in implementing, for instance, a comprehensive technology policy. And I think one of the reasons that Matt and I are here is that we're trying to demonstrate that it is possible We are in different parties. We're proudly in different parties, but we can find common areas to work together. If every administration reverses the policy of the previous administration on technology or military programs, then it will be impossible to affect anything, because most of the major initiatives cannot be successfully implemented in a couple of years. They take successive administrations. And so if you ask me what is the biggest challenge that we face in the United States, yes, we have big problems in investing in parts of the country that have been largely abandoned. We face huge issues in a variety of arenas. But what we've really experienced is a breakdown in what I would describe as elite consensus about what's important in terms of what we need to do. For me, the things that are going to be essential going forward, one is going to be investment in our key areas of advantage. One of those areas is education, the other is technology, and that means welcoming foreign students in the United States, particularly from countries like Japan and India. And second is to recognize that we need to reimagine and recommit to our allies and our partners, the key countries that we work with on the global stage. And most of those countries are in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. If we can find common purpose, and I believe there is broad bipartisan consensus between key Democrats and Republicans to do this, if we can find a way forward to sustain that, I believe that the United States will be positioned well for the 21st century. But if we try to go it alone, or if we alienate countries like Japan and Australia, we will be in a very difficult set of circumstances as a result.
Well, about the tariff negotiations, they are still ongoing. There are certain things that I cannot really comment on, and I don't really know the overall picture. Having said that, in the U.S.-Japan relations, the Japanese people working hard, and then now we have those surplus. But then there's a reinvestment in the United States. In a way, Japan has become kind of a convenient country for the United States. Perhaps Japan can reap more benefits, but we don't have a market here. Whereas in the United States, you have a huge market, so perhaps there's nothing we can do yet. But for the United States, Japan is a good country. We would like to be appreciated more by the United States. So Japan is now making an investment in the United States. We are #1 investor. More than 1 million people get jobs thanks to investments from Japan. I think that needs to be emphasized more, and the government of Japan does emphasize that, and we would like the American people to understand that. Please appreciate what we're doing for the United States, and that's something that I'd like to call upon. Now, for ordinary Americans, when they understand that, as I said before, it could perhaps serve as a kind of a political force. Nippon Steel, what has happened? I don't know the detail, but in the final analysis, accepting this investment from the United States will be in the national interests of the United States. That was the judgment, I believe, by the U.S. president. And I think it's important to accumulate this.
I argued for this outcome in the Biden administration. I lost. I very much support the decision that President Trump has taken. It is the right decision for workers in Pennsylvania and for innovative joint capacities in top-notch steel. If I could, though, I'm going to take this opportunity to just give Japanese colleagues one bit of advice, and I should give this privately to Akiba-san, but I'll tell you how I would think about this. These negotiations on trade are being conducted in a very narrow set of parameters between trade officials in the United States and Japan. They're looking at a few narrow issues. The fact is, if you broaden the aperture and look at the full range of things in the U.S.-Japan relationship, Akiba-san is exactly right, and Japan meets all the criteria of the R's that Matt is describing: respect, reciprocity, commitment to joint efforts. Japan has stepped up on military spending. It's the biggest investor in the United States, most generous host nation support, fantastic host for our forward deployed capabilities, a partner for everything we do in the world, in Ukraine, in the Pacific, in Southeast Asia, in India. They are the best partners one could have. And so my recommendation to Japan is to broaden the scope, to explain to the Trump administration, no, it's not just narrow issues associated with autos and auto parts. Look at the broader engagement, how welcoming Japan is for so many different things, including services, not just in products, but services, how Japan has been a partner with the United States. And so my counsel would be to make the argument about how Japan is the necessary, strongest partner of the United States in so many different ways, and they're already fulfilling the criteria that President Trump has asked for from the key players. So not a narrow negotiation. That does not serve Japan's interests. Broaden it to include security and issues around technology and economics as well. Matt?
You want to?
Yes, and I agree with Kurt. If you look at the problem the United States just faced with China squeezing the choke point of magnets and rare earths elements, Japan has gone through this. Back in 2010, during the Senkaku crisis that erupted briefly, then China squeezed Japan and hurting auto manufacturers. Japan has since been able to reduce its dependency on China by roughly half, almost half. So there must be a way for Japan to help the United States and together build an alternative supply chain, learn how to find alternatives to certain rare earths magnets, find ways to recycle existing magnets and remagnetize magnets, build stockpiles together, and then pull in Australia, pull in India. That's the Quad. The Quad's there for a reason. It's actually a natural sort of a coalition. So I would agree that finding ways to help the United States out of its predicament with China might be something that unlocks greater success in the bilateral trade relationship.
But do you think there should be or there could be any alternative framework for the international trade mechanism if WTO doesn't work? I mean, it doesn't look like working now. Do you think any new frameworks coming up over the next 5 years, let's say?
Can I, on that, just real quick, I didn't cut us on, I didn't answer your very good question. I'll hear what Matt has to say. The most trouble I've ever gotten in politically in administrations I've served in is supporting TPP. And what concerns me is that dominant in both our political parties right now, Democrats and Republicans, is a deep ambivalence about just fundamental elements associated with international trade. I believe it is possible to construct trade deals with our key allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific that will still secure advantages for the United States and will make sure that we're working more closely with our allies and partners across a variety of new venues, particularly electronic and other kinds of digital trade, which are going to be essential. Some of the old kinds of manners of approach which deal with hard legacy issues, let's continue to struggle over those issues, but let's recognize that in digital and particularly other things, we desperately need greater coordination among key countries. And so, like, the truth is that TPP, it was difficult back in the time. The logic for it, or something like it, that is advanced, that increases more connectivity between key partners in the Indo-Pacific, is more powerful today than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So I'd love to find a way forward. I know Matt argued for that inside his own administration. Frankly, I do not know what's possible right now, given how trade in the United States is a contentious issue. It's a 4-letter word, although it's a 5-letter word. It's hard to talk about politically. I'd love to find ways to build consensus around it. I actually think that is one of the key roles that Japan can do to help us going forward. Matt?
Look, when China was brought into the WTO, this is at a time when China was on its way to becoming the world's second largest economy. But an economy that does not enjoy the rule of law, and an economy that has state plans to dominate all of the technological sectors of the 21st century. So this was not this was like bringing a hippopotamus onto a surfboard. It flipped it capsized the surfboard with all of us on it, all the WTO members on it. If China had been a rule of law system that really did respect concepts like comparative advantage and that really did want to increase overall two-way trade, the hippopotamus might have been able to surf on the surfboard. Instead, it stood at one end and capsized it. So there's no new multilateral trade arrangement that can bring in both the United States and China, so long as China is a Leninist dictatorship that means to dominate all technology. So that means we have to come up with more creative ideas, and that's okay. It means we have to start sort of the way that GATT started, that ultimately turned into the WTO. We have to start with some like-minded economies that trust one another, to at least want to increase trade reciprocally, economies that do enjoy the rule of law, and start that way. Look, TPP, Kurt and I have this in common as well, because early in the first Trump administration, in fact, it was just before Trump was inaugurated, I wrote a memo about revisiting TPP to see what would be possible. I almost got fired for that. But what were the things that got that ultimately doomed U.S. participation in TPP? One is that it looked as though there was a back door for China to eventually get in to the organization, and many people in the U.S. do not trust being in a multilateral agreement with China. The second is the enforcement mechanism. And I believe that if President Trump were convinced that the United States could enforce bilaterally, at least with some of the economies that are not rule of law economies, like Vietnam, say, but that if the U.S. could enforce the rule bilaterally, it might be willing to go into a multilateral arrangement. So we should start with a smaller group. Look at the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty allies. It's not a majority of the world's countries, but they account for $60 trillion in economic, in GDP. $60 trillion. That's more than twice the economies of these, what I would call the Axis powers: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. In fact, those are 1/3 of the size of the U.S. just with its treaty allies. Why don't we start with a group, a G7 plus some other willing members, and approach it that way?
May I? Yeah, you talked about TPP. About the TPP, yes, yes, the U.S. created it, and Japan was really the force to participate, and we participated, but the U.S. withdrew. But we are glad because we have been able to, or we are now starting to have the high level to trade relations. Now the UK is a member. About the EU, perhaps we can encourage EU to become members. if they feel comfortable and if they agree to become members, I think as a message to the international community, we could do so. About the United States, Japan is willing to wait. Certain articles that need to be amended, or certain articles, provisions that need to be added, the U.S. can come up with a proposal, and we can study all together. With the United States, we should create a constructive relation, and we should work out a trade scheme, because we cannot do this without the United States. We'll be patient. We'll be waiting for you. Now, you mentioned the WTO. There were certain limits what WTO could do. In relation to that, there are many people who talk about China. I understand that. Having said that, the real big principles to the international community making some contribution from the United States, I think that was one approach, but it's no longer realistic. We should be prepared for that. So CPTPP, well, Canada, they asserted this CPTPP. What's going to look like? Perhaps we should revisit this. We can think about this again.
Thank you. 3 minutes to go. I must open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand. Please kindly be very concise if you have any question. If you raise your hand, the microphone will be brought to you.
Thank you. Colonel Pottinger, I was wondering, a few years ago you wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs in which you said that Dr. Kissinger was worried before he passed away about the U.S. being at the coast of the world. Did he mention anything to you in that context of where Japan fit into that? Were those fears on his mind in the context of that article?
You said, did who?
Dr. Kissinger, Secretary Kissinger.
Oh, Kissinger. Yeah, great. You've promoted me to colonel. I got out of the Marine Corps as a mere major. So, but thanks for that. I had the pleasure of meeting on several occasions with Dr. Kissinger when I was in office and afterwards. I think that, and he and I were both very open with one another about where we had different views. I think that he is someone who really believed that America's pathway was in some kind of a condominium with China. China earned, not China, but the Chinese Communist Party, and we should always differentiate between these two things, right? I think the Chinese Communist Party earned my distrust through its actions over the course of many years under multiple administrations, and I just didn't think that there was a way for the United States to protect its, not just its national security and its prosperity, but even its sovereignty without its alliance with Japan, its alliance with South Korea, its alliance with Australia and the Philippines, fellow democracies that have common values, but above all, value sovereignty, which is something that Beijing, as you can see with its support of the biggest war in Europe since 1945, Beijing does not respect sovereignty. And on those grounds, I didn't see a Kissingerian sort of play. I'll let Dr. Kissinger's own memoirs and his biographers speak for his late in life views, but they became more complicated and interesting.
Can I just on that, if I could, please? If you think about strategy towards the Indo-Pacific over the course of 40 years, the dominant view for much of that period at elite levels was that the thing that was most important was to get the U.S.-China relationship right, and that all subsequent other relations were secondary. And in fact, that was so dominant and so elite in Republican and Democratic circles that was what animated strategy for a long period of time. There were a couple of people, and they have to be mentioned here, and it was a lonely crusade in some respects that argued that the best way to deal with strategy, the Indo-Pacific, was not inside out, i.e. deal with China and then with the surrounding issues, but to deal with the countries that were our allies and partners along the lines that Matt Pottinger just described. So two giants who passed recently, and we all owe an enormous gratitude to them. Joe Nye and Rich Armitage were part of a small, we happy few that believed in the importance of allies and partners. For decades, we operated as a very small minority in the strategic cohort of people that worked on the Indo-Pacific. I'm proud to say that even though that was a small group for decades, it is now the dominant group in American foreign policy. And so Joe and Rich died largely achieving their mission in driving this logic. I have great regard for Dr. Kissinger, but he really was in the former camp. Matt's being very delicate here. And I don't think until relatively late gave the allies and partners the accord that they are due. And our strategy is more stable and more solid working with allies and partners than working from the inside out. That was so in vogue for decades.
はい、はい、ありがとうございます。
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are already 2 minutes overboard, so we must wrap it up. Unfortunately, the U.S.-Japan relations and the importance of the U.S.-Japan relations, repeatedly it has been communicated. We can't really predict what Trump administration will do, but we would like to believe the importance of the U.S.-Japan relations, and there are certain things that we must do, and of course it was mentioned about Japan, and we have to do what we must do. Perhaps we should have discussed other things. I would like to apologize for bad chairmanship, but I would like to ask you to join me in thanking all the members of the panel with a round of applause. Thank you so much.